I was freezing. Standing in the blizzard outside my own multi-million-dollar estate. My husband had just handed me $100 bill and told me to sleep at a cheap highway motel. Why? Because my dusty military uniform embarrassed his billionaire boss. I walked out into the snow without shedding a single tear. But I made sure my phone was recording every single word. I didn't know that just hours later. A catastrophic accident on an icy bridge would broadcast my face across national television. And I had absolutely no idea that the very same billionaire my husband was trying to impress was about to watch Julian's entire fake, high society empire burn to the ground. This is a story about discovering that true power doesn't come from enduring disrespect, but from knowing exactly when to walk away. If you believe that karma always catches up to toxic people, please hit the like button. Share your own thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice and resilience. I thought surviving a war zone was the hardest thing I would ever do. I was wrong. The most dangerous battlefield was not thousands of miles away, in a desert trench. It was right inside my own living room, on a snowy Christmas Eve. My name is Clara Mitchell. I am a major in the United States Army. I had just spent 8 agonizing months coordinating supply lines under constant enemy threat. For 240 days, I slept with my boots on. I ate cold rations. I listened to the distant, terrifying thud of mortar fire. Through it all, only one thought kept me sane. I just wanted to go home. I wanted to smell the fresh pine needles of our Christmas tree. I wanted to feel the warmth of my own fireplace. Most importantly, I wanted to feel my husband, Julian, wrap his arms around me and tell me I was safe. The drive from the base took 4 hours. The snow was falling heavily, coating the highway in a thick, blinding white sheet. My heater was broken. My bones ached from exhaustion, but my heart was racing with pure, unfiltered hope. I finally pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of our estate. It was a beautiful, sprawling home. I bought it 3 years ago. Every single brick, every imported window, every manicured shrub was paid for by my combat hazard pay. I grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bag from the trunk. It was with sand and engine grease. I walked up the salted brick path, my combat boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. I pushed open the custom mahogany front door. The scent of cinnamon, roasting meats, and expensive vanilla candles washed over me. It was intoxicating. It was everything I had dreamed of in the desert. But there was no welcome. There was no embrace. I stepped into the grand foyer and dropped my heavy bag. The dull thud echoed through the house. From the formal dining room, 2 figures emerged. It was Julian, my husband of 10 years, and his mother, Victoria. They froze. They did not look at me with relief. They did not look at me with love. They looked at me with absolute, horrifying embarrassment. Julian was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit. The dark wool was flawlessly tailored, a garment that cost more than a junior enlisted soldier makes in 3 months. I recognized the suit. I had paid the credit card bill for it last week from a bunker. Victoria stood beside him. She wore a silk emerald dress, her neck heavy with diamonds. She was arranging a vase of imported white orchids. She stopped, her manicured fingers hovering in the air. Her lip curled upward in a sneer of pure disgust. "Clara," Julian said. His voice was not warm. It was tight, slick and dripping with corporate anxiety. "You are early. You weren't supposed to be back until January." I stood there, my uniform stiff with dried sweat and dust. "I got an early transport. I wanted to surprise you for Christmas." Victoria sighed. It was a delicate, practiced sound of suffering. She stepped forward, keeping a careful distance as if I were carrying a contagious disease. "Darling," she whispered, her voice laced with poison. "You look so aggressive, and you smell like diesel fuel and dirt. This is entirely unacceptable." I stared at her, too stunned to speak. My brain, trained to process complex tactical data in milliseconds, simply could not comprehend what was happening. Julian stepped forward, smoothing his expensive tie. "Richard Montgomery is coming to dinner tonight. Clara, he is the CEO of the wealth management firm. My promotion to vice president depends entirely on this evening. I need everything to be perfect. I can shower, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I can change. I just want to sit at my own table. No, Victoria snapped. Julian has painted a picture of a refined, elegant, stay-at-home wife who manages local charities. You simply do not fit the aesthetic tonight. Clara, you have no class, no feminine aura. You will humiliate him. I looked at Julian, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for the man I loved to stand up for his wife, the wife who bled for his luxury cars. He didn't. He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. It is for the best, Clara Julian said smoothly, holding the money out to me. Go stay at that little motel by the highway. Just for tonight. Be reasonable. We can talk tomorrow. My heart shattered. It did not break slowly. It shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces. But I did not cry. A military officer is trained to survive ambushes. You do not panic. You gather intelligence. Operating on pure instinct, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket. I blindly pressed the record button on my phone. You want me to leave my own house? I asked, making sure my voice was loud and clear for the microphone. On Christmas Eve. Because my military uniform embarrasses you in front of your boss. Do not make a scene. Clara, Julian hissed, glancing nervously at the door. Yes, take the money and leave. You are not welcome here tonight. I looked at the $100 bill. I looked at the imported Italian furniture I had paid for. I looked at the man who had stolen 10 years of my life. I took the bill from his hand. I did not say another word. I turned around, picked up my heavy duffel bag, and walked out into the freezing blizzard. I let the heavy mahogany door slam shut behind me. The cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind howled across the empty street, biting through my thin uniform jacket. I climbed back into my freezing car. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the ignition key. I drove exactly 1 mile down the road. I found the cheap, neon-lit motel Julian had mentioned. The sign flickered in the darkness. Room 14 smelled like stale smoke, bleach, and failure. The wallpaper was peeling. The mattress sagged in the middle. I locked the deadbolt. I dropped my bag on the floor. And then, standing alone in the dim yellow light, I finally broke. I fell to my knees on the stained carpet. I wept. I did not cry quietly. I sobbed with the deep, agonizing grief of a woman who realizes her entire adult life has been a carefully constructed lie. I was nothing to them. I was a human ATM, a disposable asset. A crude mercenary who funded their high society masquerade but was too ugly to sit at their table. For an hour, I let the pain wash over me. I mourned the marriage I thought I had. I mourned the future I had planned. Then the silence of the motel room was shattered by a sound I knew too well. Sirens, not just one. A massive, echoing chorus of emergency vehicles tearing down the highway. My tears stopped instantly. The soldier inside me woke up, instantly overriding the broken wife. I ran out the door. The freezing wind whipped my face. Just a half-mile down the road, on the elevated Route 18 bridge. Red and blue lights painted the falling snow. I sprinted toward the chaos. My combat boots slipped on the black ice, but I did not slow down. I reached the police barricade and pushed my way through the frantic crowd. A massive pileup had occurred on the slick asphalt, but that was not the crisis. A civilian sedan had been violently rear-ended. It had smashed through the metal guardrail. The car was currently dangling over the edge of the bridge, groaning loudly. Below it was the freezing, pitch-black river. The rear wheels were spinning in the empty air. The front half of the car was already submerged in the icy water, sinking fast. First responders were scrambling, but they were lacking heavy rescue equipment. The ice was cracking. The car was slipping. I did not think. I did not ask for permission. I just moved. I scrambled down the steep, frozen embankment, sliding through the snow and mud until I hit the riverbank. The water was waist-deep near the edge and completely frozen. The car was sinking deeper by the second. Inside the back seat, trapped behind shattered glass, a teenage girl was screaming. Her hands slapped against the window. The water was rising to her chest. I waded into the river. The sub-zero temperature felt like 1,000 needles driving into my skin. My lungs seized. My vision blurred, but I kept moving. I reached the submerged rear door of the sedan. The metal was crushed, jamming the lock mechanism entirely. I wrapped my uniform jacket around my fist, creating a makeshift pad. I pulled my arm back and delivered a devastating, bone-crushing strike to the corner of the window. The glass exploded. Freezing water rushed into the cabin. I reached through the jagged edges of the broken window. The sharp glass sliced deep into my forearm, but the adrenaline masked the pain. I grabbed the terrified girl by the collar of her winter coat. "I have you." I roared over the sound of the cracking ice. "Do not let go." With every ounce of strength left in my exhausted body, I hauled her upward. I pulled her through the shattered window just as the car gave a final, sickening metallic groan. I threw my body backward, shielding her from the jagged metal. We fell together onto the solid ice near the riverbank. 1 second later, the sedan slipped entirely beneath the black water, disappearing forever. I dragged the coughing, shivering girl up the embankment. Paramedics immediately swarmed us, wrapping her in thermal blankets. A news crew was already on the scene, a cameraman running toward me with a blinding light. I stood up. My uniform was soaked in freezing water and my own blood. I felt a microphone shoved near my face, but I could not hear the reporter's questions. The world began to spin. The adrenaline finally abandoned me. I collapsed into the snow. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The room was warm, blindingly white. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room. My right arm was heavily bandaged. There was an IV in my wrist, pumping warm fluids into my veins. "Try not to move. Major Mitchell." The voice was deep, calm, and incredibly warm. I turned my head. Sitting in a chair beside my bed was a man in blue scrubs and a white coat. He had kind, tired eyes and a gentle smile. "I am Dr. Thomas Hayes," he said softly, setting a chart down on the bedside table. "You suffered mild hypothermia and a deep laceration on your arm, but you are going to be fine. You saved that girl's life tonight." I looked down at my bandaged arm. The memory of the freezing water rushed back, followed immediately by the memory of Julian's cold, cruel face. To my absolute horror, my chin began to tremble. I tried to lock my jaw. I tried to pull back into my military discipline, but I was so tired. I was so incredibly tired of being strong. A single tear slipped down my cheek. Dr. Hayes did not look away. He did not look embarrassed by my tears, the way Julian would have. He leaned forward and gently handed me a tissue. "You are shaking." "Clara," he said gently, using my first name. "Soldiers aren't supposed to cry," I whispered, my voice raw and broken. I tried to turn my face away in shame. Thomas reached out. His fingers lightly touched my uninjured hand. His grip was steady and safe. "You are a human being before you are a soldier, Clara," Thomas said, his voice anchoring me in the room. "And holding on to pain doesn't make you strong. It just makes you heavy. You do not have to wear your armor in here. You are safe now. Let it go." I looked into his eyes, for the first time in 10 years. I did not see someone demanding something from me. I saw someone offering a safe place to land. And in that quiet, brightly lit hospital room, I finally allowed myself to break, knowing someone was there to help me rebuild. Miles away from the sterile quiet of the hospital room, a very different scene was unfolding inside the dining room of my estate. The grand mahogany table was set with flawless precision. Crystal wine glasses caught the ambient light of the imported chandelier. A roaring fire crackled in the marble hearth, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Julian was playing the role of the perfect, sophisticated host. He was pouring a glass of incredibly rare vintage red wine for his boss, Richard Montgomery. Richard was a self-made billionaire, a man who had built a financial empire from nothing. He was known throughout the industry for his ruthless efficiency, but also for his uncompromising, strict ethical standards. He sat at the head of my table, his posture rigid, his sharp eyes taking in the opulent surroundings. Victoria sat to his right, wearing her emerald silk dress and a carefully rehearsed, charming smile. She was delicately slicing into a piece of roasted duck, playing the part of the wealthy matriarch. "This is a magnificent property, Julian," Richard said, his deep voice carrying a tone of careful assessment. I ran a routine background check when considering you for the vice president's seat. I noticed the deed is registered under the name Mitchell, a family trust. I presume Julian did not miss a beat. He offered a smooth, practice lie without a shred of hesitation. Yes, exactly. It is part of my wife's family portfolio. I manage all the assets, of course. Clara is utterly exhausted from her charity galas. She is currently away at a luxury wellness retreat in the mountains. She sends her deepest apologies for missing this dinner. Victoria laughed softly. A delicate, airy sound. Clara is a fragile soul. Mr. Montgomery. She requires a lot of rest and pampering. Julian works so incredibly hard to provide her with such a beautiful life. Richard took a slow sip of his wine, nodding politely, though his sharp eyes seemed to pierce right through Julian's polished veneer. In the background, the massive flat-screen television in the living room was humming quietly, tuned to a local news channel. Suddenly, the screen flashed crimson red. A breaking news alert sounded. A sharp electronic tone that sliced Nate through the gentle classical music playing on the stereo. The broadcast abruptly cut to shaky, visceral cell phone footage. It was dark, chaotic, and illuminated by the frantic flashing of red and blue police lights. The camera zoomed in on a shattered car dangling precariously off the edge of the icy Route 18 bridge. The water below was pitch black and freezing. Richard Montgomery stopped talking. His fork hovered halfway to his mouth, his eyes locked onto the television screen. The shaky camera captured a woman in a soaked, blood-stained military jacket. She was hauling a terrified, soaking wet teenage girl out of the shattered back window of the sinking vehicle. The woman threw her body backward, shielding the girl from the jagged metal as the car gave a final, metallic groan and plunged into the icy depths. The crystal wine glass slipped through Richard Montgomery's fingers. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered violently, sending a spray of dark red wine across the pristine white rug. Julian jumped back, startled. Sir, is everything all right? Let me get a towel quiet, Richard commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. He stood up slowly, pushing his heavy oak chair back. He walked toward the television, his eyes wide with absolute, paralyzing horror. The camera on the news broadcast zoomed in on the rescued girl's face. She was coughing, wrapped in a blanket, shivering violently. That is Emily. Richard breathed, his voice breaking. That is my niece. Julian's face drained of all color. He swallowed hard, trying to regain control of the room. Oh, my word. What a terrible tragedy. Thank goodness she is safe. But sir, let us turn that off. It is upsetting you. That woman who saved her is just some local brute. Nobody important. Richard turned his head slowly. The look in his eyes could have melted steel. He pointed a trembling finger at the television screen. The news anchor was now showing a clear, high-definition photograph of the rescuer collapsing into the snow. That brute, Richard growled, his voice vibrating with barely contained fury, is wearing an army uniform. And the name-a-tape on her chest clearly says Mitchell. The dining room went dead silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Richard connected the dots with the terrifying speed of a seasoned corporate predator. He looked at the opulent house. He looked at Julian's designer suit. He remembered the background check. And he remembered Julian's excuse from 5 minutes ago. You said your wife was at a luxury spa, Richard said, taking a slow step toward Julian. Panic seized Julian's throat. Sir, I can explain. It is a complicated marital situation. Victoria, desperate to save the evening, and completely oblivious to the catastrophic danger, stood up and waved her hand dismissively. Oh, please, Mr. Montgomery, do not let this ruin your appetite. She is just a crude, uncultured soldier. We had to ask her to leave the house tonight to protect your evening. She simply does not belong in high society. Richard Montgomery stared at the woman in the emerald dress, his jaw locked. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. You threw a decorated war hero out into a blizzard, Richard roared, unleashing the terrifying authority of a billionaire who had just witnessed sheer evil. You threw a woman out of her own home on Christmas Eve. The woman who just risked her life to save my family. A woman whose combat pays is clearly funding your pathetic, parasitic lifestyle. Julian shrank back, trembling like a frightened child. Sir, please. My promotion. You have no promotion. Richard snarled, grabbing his heavy winter coat from the chair. You have no job. You are fired. Effective immediately. And by tomorrow morning, I will personally ensure that every financial firm on this continent knows exactly what kind of coward you are. You will never work in this industry again. The front door slammed shut. The house fell into a deafening, suffocating silence, leaving Julian and Victoria standing in the ruins of their shattered empire. Julian Sterling thought he was a master strategist. He thought he could outsmart the destruction of his career by securing his financial safety net. At 8 o'clock the next morning, panicking and desperate, he walked into the grand lobby of the primary bank, where all our accounts were held. He intended to drain every single dollar from our joint savings, investment portfolios, and checking accounts, planning to transfer the funds to a private offshore account his mother had set up. He approached the teller with his usual arrogant swagger, demanding an immediate wire transfer. The teller typed his information into the system, paused, and frowned. She called the branch manager. Julian was ushered into a small, windowless office. The bank manager looked at him with polite indifference. I apologize, Mr. Sterling, but I cannot process this transfer, the manager said smoothly. All of your associated accounts were frozen at 6 o'clock this morning by a federal court order. Julian's face contorted in rage. Frozen? On what grounds? Half of that money is mine. The freeze was initiated by Major Clara Mitchell's legal counsel, the manager explained, sliding a legal document across the desk. The injunction was granted based on submitted evidence of severe financial abuse and documented intent of abandonment. Your wife's lawyers moved very quickly. Julian stared at the paper in absolute shock. I had not been sleeping in that hospital bed. While Dr. Hayes has monitored my vitals, I had been making phone calls. I had sent my lawyers the audio recording from Christmas Eve, the recording where Julian explicitly admitted to kicking me out of my own home and withholding my access to the property. It was all the proof the judge needed to lock him out of my military-funded empire entirely. 1 week later, the final blow landed. I pulled my rental car up to the curb across the street from my estate. The winter sun was bright, but the air was bitterly cold. I sat in the driver's seat, resting my bandaged arm on the center console, and watched the magnificent collapse of Julian Sterling. 2 heavy tow trucks were parked in the driveway. Men in thick canvas jackets were currently hooking heavy steel chains to Julian's beloved, custom-ordered luxury sedan. Another man was dragging Victoria's imported sports car onto a flatbed. Julian and Victoria stood on the icy driveway, surrounded by 4 large, designer leather suitcases. The locks on the house had already been changed. My legal team had executed a flawless, brutal eviction, since the house was entirely in my name. And Julian had practically confessed to abandonment on tape. He had absolutely no legal right to remain on the premises. I stepped out of my car and walked slowly across the street. The cold air stung my cheeks, but I felt incredibly light. Julian saw me approaching, his arrogant, polished facade completely dissolved. He looked broken, exhausted, and terrified. He was wearing a wrinkled coat, his hair uncombed. He ran toward me, practically tripping over the icy pavement, and dropped to his knees right in front of my boots. Clara, please. Julian begged, tears streaming down his red, freezing face. His voice cracked with sheer desperation. I am so sorry. I lost my job. I have nothing. Please do not do this. I am your husband. We are partners. We are equals. Victoria stood shivering near her suitcases, completely silent, her vanity finally crushed under the weight of reality. I looked down at the man kneeling in the snow. 10 years ago, this sight would have broken my heart. Today, I felt absolutely nothing. No hatred, no pity, no love. Just the clinical indifference of an officer surveying a neutralized threat. We were never equals. Julian, I said, my voice calm. steady and devoid of emotion. Because you do not even know the meaning of the word. You wanted a human ATM, not a wife. You chose your battlefield. Now you get to die on it. I turned my back on him. I did not watch him cry. I did not watch him gather his bags and walk away into obscurity with his silent, shivering mother. I simply walked toward the front porch of my home. As I reached the top step, a familiar, heavy truck pulled into the driveway. The engine cut off, and the driver's door opened. Dr. Thomas Hayes stepped out. He was wearing a thick, worn leather jacket and dark jeans, looking completely out of place in this wealthy neighborhood, yet looking perfectly, wonderfully real. He smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes, and held up 2 large cardboard cups of steaming coffee. "I thought you might need some backup," Thomas said softly, walking up the steps to meet me. "And some caffeine." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had seen me covered in blood, shivering in a hospital bed, weeping from absolute heartbreak, and had not asked me to hide any of it. He did not want my money. He did not care about my status. He just wanted to make sure I was warm. "I think the war is officially over, Thomas," I said, taking the coffee from his hands. "Good," he replied, gently resting his hand against the small of my back. "Then it is time for rest." I unlocked the heavy mahogany door. We stepped inside the house together. The air was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. For the first time in 10 years, I finally felt like I was truly home. The weeks that followed Julian's departure were the quietest I had ever experienced. For 10 years, my life had been dictated by the relentless noise of other people's expectations. There had been the literal deafening roar of military deployment, the helicopters, the sirens, the constant radio chatter, but there was also the insidious, suffocating noise of my marriage. Julian and Victoria had filled this house with a constant barrage of subtle criticisms, passive-aggressive sighs, and demands for a perfection I could never achieve. Now the house was entirely silent. At first, that silence was terrifying. It forced me to sit with the uncomfortable reality of what I had allowed myself to endure. I began the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming my territory. I did not just change the locks. I changed the entire soul of the house. I took down the cold, sterile abstract paintings Victoria had purchased with my money and replaced them with warm, vibrant landscapes. I threw away the imported white orchids she loved so much and filled the rooms with resilient, colorful potted ferns and sturdy oak furniture. Dr. Thomas Hayes became a steady, grounding presence during this transition. He did not push. He did not overwhelm me. He simply showed up. Some evenings, he would arrive after a long shift at the hospital, bringing takeout food in simple cardboard boxes. We would sit on the floor of my half-empty living room, eating ordinary food and talking for hours. It was during these quiet conversations that my true healing began. My journey was not just about escaping a toxic marriage. It was a profound awakening to my own human rights and the true definition of equality. One evening, as the winter snow began to melt into early spring, I sat by the fireplace with Thomas. I looked at the flickering flames and finally spoke the words that had been sitting heavy in my chest. For years, I believed that love meant endless sacrifice. I told him, wrapping my hands around a warm mug of tea. I thought that by providing financially, by enduring the emotional neglect, by constantly making myself smaller to fit into Julian's grand aesthetic, I was being a good wife. I thought I was protecting our marriage, but I was fundamentally violating my own right to be treated with basic human dignity. Thomas set his mug down and looked at me. His eyes were incredibly perceptive, completely devoid of the judgment I was so used to seeing in Julian. "You were a victim of emotional abuse, Clara," Thomas said gently, his voice firm but compassionate. "We live in a world where women, especially those who are strong, successful, or in non-traditional roles like the military, are often expected to shrink themselves to protect the fragile egos of others." Julian and Victoria's behavior was textbook psychological manipulation. They tried to strip you of your identity because your strength and your undeniable reality threatened their empty vanity. Hearing him say it out loud, hearing a man validate my reality without making excuses for my abuser felt like a heavy iron chain snapping off my chest. I let them make me feel like a guest in my own life, I whispered, the realization washing over me. I paid for the roof over their heads, yet I apologized for walking on the floors. True equality in a relationship does not just mean splitting the bills or sharing a bank account. It means mutual respect for each other's humanity. It means your partner should be your safest place, not your harshest critic. Thomas reached over and gently took my hand. His grip was warm and solid. You are exactly right. You have a fundamental human right to be cherished, to be heard, and to be respected exactly as you are. Emotional vulnerability is not a weakness. Clara, it is the ultimate strength, and you never have to hide it from me. Over the next few months, I channeled that realization into action. I began volunteering at a local women's shelter, specifically working with female veterans transitioning back into civilian life. I stood in front of rooms filled with brave, broken women and shared my story. I told them about the night I was thrown into the blizzard. I told them about the financial exploitation. I educated them on the subtle red flags of gaslighting. I taught them that enduring disrespect is never a badge of honor. Through helping them recognize their own worth, I cemented my own. I was no longer just a survivor of a war zone overseas. I was a survivor of the domestic battlefield, armed with the knowledge of my own undeniable value. A full year passed. The bitter, freezing winter that had shattered my life faded into a distant memory, replaced by a new, incredibly warm holiday season. The divorce was finalized smoothly and brutally, stripped of my financial backing and blacklisted by Richard Montgomery. Julian had vanished into absolute obscurity. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working a low-level administrative job in a different state, living in a cramped apartment with his mother. The fake empire they had built on my back had crumbled entirely, leaving nothing but dust. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after I was thrown out into the snow, my house was full of light and laughter. The grand mahogany table was not set for a pompous billionaire or toxic in-laws. It was set for my real family. Emily, the teenage girl I had pulled from the freezing river, sat at the table with her parents. Her uncle, Richard Montgomery, sat across from her, raising a glass of sparkling cider and a cheerful toast. Richard had become a dear friend over the past year, a staunch supporter of the veteran women's charity I was now running. And sitting right beside me, holding my hand under the table, was Thomas. The house smelled of roasting turkey, fresh pine, and genuine joy. There was no pressure to perform. There was no aesthetic to maintain. I wore a comfortable, thick wool sweater. I laughed loudly. I did not monitor my posture or apologize for taking up space. Simply Clara. After dinner, as the guests moved to the living room to watch the snow fall outside the massive windows, Thomas pulled me aside into the quiet hallway. He looked down at me, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the holiday lights. "You look incredibly beautiful tonight," he said, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. "Beautiful," I replied, and for the first time in my entire life, I meant it. "I feel safe." "You always will be," Thomas promised, leaning to press a soft, lingering kiss against my forehead, in his arms. I had found the ultimate Western romance, a love built on absolute equality, unwavering support, and deep, profound respect. As I stood there, wrapped in his embrace, I looked out at the life I had rebuilt from the ashes. I realized that my story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every woman who had ever been made to feel small in her own home. Direct address to the audience. If you are listening to this right now, I need you to hear my voice clearly. If Clara's journey to reclaiming her power and finding a love that truly honors her resonated with you, I want you to know that you are not alone. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who tried to diminish your light? Have you ever loved someone who drained your resources while criticizing your character? Share your story with us in the comments below. This is a safe space, and your experience might be the exact words another woman needs to hear today to find her own courage. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode of our ongoing audio dramas. We are building a community of strong, empowered women here, and we want you to be a part of it. The emotional abuse and financial exploitation depicted in this story are very real, highly destructive tactics used by toxic individuals. If you ever find yourself recording conversations in your own home just to prove you are not going crazy, you are in danger. If your partner constantly isolates you, devalues your contributions, or makes you feel like an embarrassment, please recognize these severe red flags. Emotional manipulation and gaslighting can destroy your mental health just as violently as physical trauma. It is an insidious poison that convinces you that you deserve the poor treatment you are receiving. Trust your instincts. Secure your financial independence immediately. And never, ever be afraid to reach out to professional support networks, legal counsel, or domestic abuse hotlines. You have a fundamental, undeniable right to be treated with dignity. You are worth so much more than the bare minimum. Do not let anyone turn you into a ghost in your own life. Stand up, reclaim your territory, and build the beautiful, peaceful life you truly deserve. The tranquility of my new life was a hard-won victory. Built upon the ruins of a decade of manipulation, spring had blossomed into a brilliant, vibrant summer, and my foundation for female veterans was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. With the generous financial backing of Richard Montgomery, we had opened 3 new transition homes across the state. I spent my days surrounded by fierce, resilient women who were learning to navigate civilian life with dignity. I was fulfilled. I was respected. I was deeply, undeniably in love with Thomas. But the ghosts of a toxic past rarely vanish without attempting one final, desperate haunting. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping black coffee and reviewing architectural plans for a new shelter, when a certified letter arrived. I tore open the heavy envelope, my eyes scanning the legal jargon. It was a court summons. Julian Sterling, completely destitute and driven by sheer, unadulterated delusion, was suing for permanent spousal support. His legal filing argued that he had become accustomed to a high society lifestyle during our 10-year marriage, and that my sudden eviction had caused him undue financial and emotional hardship. He was demanding a massive monthly alimony payment and a percentage of the estate he had never paid a single dime to maintain. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply picked up my phone and called my legal team. The Clara who would have worried about Julian's public perception was dead. The major who answered the phone was ready for a definitive, final eradication of the enemy. The courtroom was cold, echoing with the severe, sterile authority of the justice system. I walked through the heavy wooden doors, wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, my posture perfectly straight. Thomas walked beside me, his hand resting securely on the small of my back, a silent, immovable pillar of strength. When I took my seat at the defendant's table, I finally looked across the aisle. Julian looked entirely unrecognizable. The bespoke Tom Ford suits were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting, cheap gray jacket that hung loosely on his thinning frame. His posture, once so arrogant and inflated with my money, was deeply hunched. He looked exhausted, bitter, and pathetic. Sitting behind him in the gallery was Victoria, clutching a faded imitation leather handbag, her face etched with the deep, permanent lines of a woman who had lost her only source of vanity. Julian's court-appointed attorney began the proceedings with a flimsy, desperate narrative. He painted Julian as a devoted husband who had managed my state while I was away, a man who had been cast out into the cold by a wealthy, ruthless military officer. He dramatically cited the standard of living Julian had enjoyed, arguing that it was my legal obligation to maintain his comfort indefinitely. I sat in absolute silence, my face a mask of calm, clinical indifference. I waited until the opposing counsel finished his desperate monologue. Then, my attorney stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not engage in theatrical posturing. She simply brought the heavy hammer of the truth crashing down on Julian's fragile glass house. "Your Honor," my attorney began, handing a thick binder of forensic accounting reports to the bailiff. The plaintiff's lifestyle was not a product of marital partnership. It was a product of systematic financial exploitation and abuse. Every luxury vehicle, every country club membership, and every designer garment was funded exclusively by Major Mitchell's combat hazard pay, while the plaintiff actively hid his own modest income in offshore accounts managed by his mother. Julian's face flushed a deep, panicked crimson. He opened his mouth to object, but his own lawyer aggressively pulled him back down into his seat. My attorney pressed a button on her laptop. The audio recording from Christmas Eve. The recording I had taken in the freezing foyer of my home echoed through the silent courtroom. Julian's slick, condescending voice filled the room, explicitly telling me I was too ugly, too crude, and too embarrassing to stay in my own home. The judge, a stern older woman with sharp eyes, stared at Julian with open, unmasked disgust. But the final, fatal blow did not come from the recording. The heavy courtroom doors swung open, and Richard Montgomery walked in. He had volunteered to testify as a character witness. Richard took the stand, his presence commanding absolute authority. He looked directly at the judge and recounted the events of that Christmas Eve in brutal, factual detail. He described Julian's pathological lies, his cowardly attempt to hide his war hero wife, and the absolute lack of integrity that led to his immediate termination. Julian Sterling is not a victim, Your Honor, Richard stated, his deep voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. He is a parasite. He built a fraudulent existence on the back of a woman who was dodging mortar fire in a combat zone. Giving this man a single dime of her money would be an insult to the concept of justice. The judge did not even need to deliberate. She dismissed Julian's petition for spousal support with extreme prejudice. She went a step further, ordering Julian to pay all of my legal fees for bringing a frivolous and maliciously intended lawsuit to her court. As the gavel slammed down, finalizing his absolute ruin, Julian buried his face in his hands and wept. It was a hollow, pathetic sound. I did not look back at him. I stood up, took Thomas by the hand, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the ghosts of my past locked away forever. 2 years later, the heavy scent of pine needles and wild lavender filled the crisp, golden autumn air. We were far away from the sterile, pretentious high society suburbs that Julian had worshipped. We were standing in the heart of a breathtaking, rustic valley in the western mountains, surrounded by towering oak trees and the gentle, rushing sound of a clear river. This was where Thomas had grown up. And this was where we had chosen to build our permanent sanctuary. There were no imported orchids. There was no crystal chandelier. There was no exhausting, performative aesthetic meant to impress billionaires or wealthy socialites. Instead, the wedding venue was a beautifully restored, open-air wooden barn, decorated with simple white string lights. Wildflowers gathered from the surrounding fields, and thick, warm woolen blankets draped over wooden benches for our guests. I stood in a small bridal suite, looking at my reflection in an antique mirror. I was not wearing a restrictive, suffocating designer gown. I wore a simple, elegant ivory dress of soft lace that allowed me to breathe, to move, and to feel the cool mountain breeze against my skin. My hair was loose, woven with small sprigs of baby's breath. For the first time in my life, I looked in the mirror and did not search for flaws to correct. I saw a woman who was whole, healed, and profoundly loved. My sister, Emma, stood behind me, gently placing a delicate silver necklace around my throat. She had tears in her eyes, but they were tears of absolute, unfiltered joy. "You did it, Clara," Emma whispered, resting her hands on my shoulders. "You fought the hardest battle, and you actually made it to the other side." I smiled, turning to pull my sister into a tight embrace. I didn't do it alone. I had the best army in the world. I stepped out of the suite and walked down the natural dirt aisle, covered in scattered autumn leaves. The faces looking back at me were the faces of my true family. I saw Emily, now a thriving college student, sitting next to her uncle, Richard Montgomery, who gave me a deeply respectful nod. I saw Harold, the elderly Korean War veteran from the community shelter, wearing a proud, sharp suit. I saw dozens of women from my veteran charity, strong, independent survivors who had become my sisters in arms. And at the end of the aisle, standing beneath a simple wooden arch woven with climbing green vines, was Thomas. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit without a tie, looking rugged, handsome, and entirely at ease. As I walked toward him, his eyes locked onto mine, filled with an emotion so deep and grounding that it took my breath away. There was no fear in his gaze. There was no demand for me to be anything other than exactly who I was. When I reached him, he took both of my hands in his. His thumbs gently traced the faint, faded scars on my knuckles, the scars I had earned breaking the glass of that sinking car, the scars that had inadvertently shattered the prison of my first marriage. The ceremony was incredibly intimate. When it was time for our vows, Thomas did not read from a piece of paper. He looked directly into my soul. "Clara," Thomas said, his voice carrying over the quiet rustle of the wind through the pines. "You have spent your entire life protecting others. You carried the weight of the world on your shoulders. And you were taught that your worth was measured by how much pain you could silently endure. Today, I vow to change that. I vow to be the place where you can finally put your armor down. I will celebrate your incredible strength, but I will fiercely protect your right to be vulnerable. I will never walk in front of you to steal your light, and I will never walk behind you to hide. I will stand exactly by your side, as your true equal, for all the days of my life." Tears streamed down my face, but I did not try to stop them. I did not feel ashamed. I let the emotion flow freely, washing away the last remaining traces of the stoic, mechanical soldier Julian had forced me to be. "Thomas," I replied, my voice shaking with beautiful, overwhelming gratitude. "You found me when I was frozen, standing in the ruins of a life that was never really mine. You did not ask me to change. You just asked me to let you in. You taught me that true love is not an extraction. It is an offering. You gave me back my humanity. I vow to build a home with you that is rooted in absolute honesty, unwavering respect, and a peace that nobody can ever take away from us." As the sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, casting a brilliant array of orange and violet light across the valley, Thomas pulled me into his arms and kissed me. The applause from our friends and family echoed through the trees, a resounding chorus of victory. Later that evening, as the stars filled the vast western sky, Thomas and I danced under the warm glow of the string lights. The nightmare of that freezing Christmas Eve felt like a lifetime ago, belonging to a different universe entirely. I rested my head against Thomas's chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I had walked through the most bitter winter of my life, but I had finally found my everlasting summer. 5 years had passed since the bitter winter that ended my first marriage. Time is a fascinating architect. When you remove the toxic elements from your foundation, the structure you build can reach heights you never thought possible. My life was no longer defined by the exhausting defense of my own worth. It was defined by purpose, by peace, and by the steady, unshakable love of my husband, Thomas. The Mitchell Hayes Foundation had grown from a small local initiative into a nationwide sanctuary. We now operated 10 transition homes across the country. We provided immediate legal counsel, psychological support, and financial literacy programs for female veterans. We specialized in helping women who had survived domestic financial abuse. We taught them how to reclaim their assets. We taught them how to untangle their military benefits from parasitic partners. We taught them how to fight back and win. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November. I was sitting in my corner office at the foundation headquarters. The space was bright, filled with natural light, green plants, and the low, comforting hum of a busy, dedicated staff. My assistant knocked gently on the open door. She looked worried. "Major Mitchell," she said softly. "There is a young woman in the lobby. Her name is Sarah. She is a former combat medic. Her husband just locked her out of their joint bank accounts and threatened to take her vehicle if she leaves him. She is terrified. She does not know what to do." I did not hesitate. I stood up from my desk. The ghost of my own past flickered in my mind, but it did not paralyze me. It fueled me. I walked into the lobby. Sarah was sitting on a soft couch, clutching a worn canvas bag. She was shaking. Her eyes were wide, scanning the room with the hypervigilant panic of a soldier trapped behind enemy lines. I knew that look. I had worn that exact look in a cheap, freezing motel room years ago. I sat down next to her. I did not speak with the cold, detached authority of a commanding officer. I spoke to her as an equal. "My name is Clara," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and steady. "You are safe here, Sarah. Nobody is going to take your car. Nobody is going to take your money. We are going to lock down your assets right now." Sarah looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "He said I have nothing without him. He said my military pension belongs to the household." "He lied to you," I told her firmly. "Abusers use financial terror because they are cowards. They cannot control your mind, so they try to control your survival. We have a team of federal lawyers upstairs. We are going to freeze his access to your accounts before the bank closes today. You are a combat medic. You have saved lives under fire. You are not going to let a civilian coward steal your future." Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. For the first time, a tiny spark of defiance cut through her panic. She nodded. I spent the next 3 hours sitting beside her in the legal department. We filed the injunctions. We secured her independent finances. We gave her the keys to a private, furnished room in one of our transition homes. When she finally walked out of the office, she was standing tall. The shaking had stopped. I walked back to my office and closed the door. The emotional weight of the day was heavy. I leaned against my desk, closing my eyes, taking a slow breath. The door opened quietly. Thomas walked in. He had just finished a surgical rotation at the hospital, but he still drove across town to check on me. He took one look at my face and understood exactly what I was carrying. He did not ask for a debrief. He did not ask me to justify my exhaustion. He simply walked over, wrapped his arms around me, and pulled me against his chest. "You fought a good battle today," Thomas whispered, kissing the top of my head. I saw myself in her, I admitted, my voice muffled against his jacket. It brought back the memory of the snow, the feeling of having nowhere to go. Thomas held me tighter. "But look at what you did with that memory, Clara. You did not let the snow freeze your heart. You used it to build a fire for someone else. You are breaking the cycle. You are rewriting the ending for hundreds of women." I looked up at him. The absolute certainty in his eyes anchored me. He was right. The pain of my past was no longer a weapon used against me. It was the armor I used to protect others. "Let's go home," Thomas said, gently taking my hand. "And for the rest of my life." Those 3 words would remain the most beautiful sound in the world. Winter arrived in the western mountains with a breathtaking, silent beauty. The first heavy snowfall coated the tall pines and blanketed the valley in pristine white. Years ago, the sight of falling snow would trigger a deep, visceral panic in my chest. It was a reminder of rejection. It was a reminder of the night I was discarded like garbage on a freezing porch. But trauma loses its power when you refuse to give it shelter. Now the snow was just snow. It was a beautiful, quiet invitation to sit by the fire. Our rustic wooden home was warm and glowing. The scent of cedarwood and roasting coffee filled the air. I was sitting in a deep leather armchair by the massive stone fireplace, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. My bare feet were tucked underneath me. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the mountain landscape looked like a painting. The river was partially frozen, sparkling under the pale winter sun. I held a letter in my hands. It had arrived in the mail that morning. It was from Emily, the girl I had pulled from the sinking car on Route 18. She had just graduated from law school. "Dear Clara," the letter read, "I am walking across the stage today to accept my degree, and I am thinking of you. I became a lawyer because I wanted to be like the woman who saved me. I want to fight for people who cannot fight for themselves. Thank you for giving me the chance to have a future. I will never waste it." I carefully folded the heavy parchment paper and smiled. The ripple effect of a single choice is a magnificent thing. When you choose courage over submission, you do not just save yourself. You grant permission for everyone around you to be brave. Thomas walked into the living room carrying two large mugs of dark coffee. He handed one to me and sat down on the edge of the stone hearth, facing my chair. He wore a simple gray sweater, his dark hair slightly messy. He looked at me with that familiar, steady adoration. "Good news from Emily?" he asked, noticing the folded paper in my lap. "She graduated," I said, a deep sense of pride swelling in my chest. "She is going to be a phenomenal attorney." Thomas smiled, taking a sip of his coffee. "She had a pretty spectacular role model." I looked out the window at the falling snow. My mind drifted briefly to Julian and Victoria. They were distant, faded ghosts. Their fake. High society empire had been built on quicksand. They had traded basic human decency for a few years of unearned luxury. And in the end, they had lost everything. They were trapped in their own miserable, bitter reality. I felt no anger toward them anymore. Anger requires energy. And I refused to spend another ounce of my energy on parasites. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked softly, pulling me back to the present. "I am thinking about the concept of value," I replied, looking deeply into his eyes. For a long time, I let a coward determine my value. I let a man who could not even earn his own living convince me that I was unworthy of respect. I thought my military discipline required me to suffer in silence. Thomas set his mug down. He reached over and gently held my hand. "And what do you think now?" "I think that true discipline is knowing when to walk away," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "True strength is refusing to participate in your own degradation." I survived a war zone. I survived a frozen river. But my greatest victory was walking out of that toxic house and never looking back. Thomas brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. The scars from the shattered glass were still there, small white lines against my skin. They were not blemishes. They were medals. "You built an unbreakable horizon, Clara," Thomas told me. "You fought for your peace, and you won." I leaned back in the chair, letting the warmth of the fire wash over me. I was a major. I was a veteran. I was a survivor. But above all, I was a woman who had finally learned her own worth. The wind howled outside, whipping the snow across the glass. But the cold could not touch me. I was safe. I was loved. And my heart, once forged in ice and betrayal, was finally, permanently, at peace. As Clara's journey comes to an end, we are left with a profound reflection on the true meaning of partnership, equality, and self-worth. For a decade, Clara believed that her sacrifices, her dangerous military deployments, her unwavering financial support were acts of love. She thought that by providing a luxurious lifestyle, she was securing her marriage. But she was trapped in a carefully constructed illusion by a toxic family that viewed her not as a human being, but as a resource. Julian and Victoria represent a very real, insidious form of emotional and financial abuse. They constantly made Clara feel small so that they could feel large. They used gaslighting to convince a decorated, brave war hero that she was unrefined, crude and unworthy of sitting at her own dining table. The turning point of this story is not just the dramatic physical rescue on the freezing river. It is the moment Clara finally decides to stop protecting the fragile ego of her abuser. By walking away from that house, she didn't lose a marriage, she lost a parasite. And in making that brave choice, she created space for genuine, equal love. Dr. Thomas Hayes did not want her money, and he did not care about her high society status. He offered her the one thing she had been denied for 10 years, a safe place to put down her armor and be vulnerable. The ultimate lesson here is that you cannot buy respect, and you should never have to earn the right to be treated with basic dignity in your own home. True love does not require you to shrink yourself or hide your strength. If you are ever made to feel like a guest in your own life, remember Clara's resilience. Walk away, reclaim your worth, and never apologize for the beautiful space you take up in this world. This content was meticulously researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons.